Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back for another episode of Adventures in Eagle Territory. My name is Becky Summerfield. Did you know that today is Endangered Species Day? Today is really about spreading awareness for more than 31,000 species of plants and animals that are threatened with extinction all over the world. And in the United States, there are around 1,300 different species that are either endangered or threatened, and many more species that could potentially be added to that list at any time. But if there is one thing that working with bald eagles has taught me, it's that there is still hope, even though those numbers seem pretty devastating. Some of you may remember a time when it was actually really rare to see bald eagles out in the wild, even though now it is quite common, even especially in Minnesota. But historically, that decline in bald eagle populations is largely attributed to a chemical called DDT. DDT was an insecticide that was used pretty heavily in the 40s and 50s and 60s, primarily to spray for mosquitoes or other pests. This is actually an ad from a 1947 issue in Time magazine that says, "DDT is good for me." And of course, those characters in this ad do look pretty happy and healthy. And just to play devil's advocate for a moment, DDT is largely attributed with eradicating malaria from the United States and from Europe, because at the time it was being used, mosquitoes were actually still transmitting malaria from person to person. And that, of course, is a fairly life-threatening illness to have. But unfortunately, this is how DDT was applied. People would just drive around in trucks and they would broadcast spray it across beaches, through residential neighborhoods, through parks, or there's even this photo of someone spraying the pool. And because that chemical smelled really, really sweet, kind of like candy, a lot of kids would actually run after those trucks or run after the spray so that they could play in it because of how good that it smelled. Now, farmers could use this to apply to their crops to combat those pests that could be damaging those crops, which of course those farmers would rely on for their livelihoods. But this was also a very common household product. People might have a can of this under their kitchen sink with the rest of their cleaners so that they could spray down their house or possibly even spray down their kids. But what they started to realize is that over time, when DDT got into the environment, it would stick around for a really long time. It would build up and build up in the environment, in the soil, or possibly get washed away into a wetland where it would be absorbed by plant life. And since plants are typically at the bottom or the base of the food chain, that chemical is going to work its way all the way up to the top, eventually to those apex predators like the bald eagle. And through this process of biomagnification, it's actually the higher up the food chain that has the highest concentration of that toxic chemical. But DDT did not necessarily kill eagles directly. What it did was accumulate in their bodies and inhibit their calcium production in eagles and in a lot of other migratory birds as well. And so when an eagle or another species of bird would go to lay their eggs, those shells would be really, really thin or deformed, so that when the bird would go to sit on those eggs to incubate them, they would break. So rather than kill the eagles directly, what DDT did was prevent them from having enough offspring that would grow up to replace those adult populations once they eventually passed away naturally. So that is why in 1963, there was a bald eagle population count of the lower 48 states. They estimated that there was only 487 nesting pairs of eagles left in all of the lower 48 states. On the stretch of the Mississippi River between Wabasha and Rock Island, Illinois, between 1968 and 1972, there was only one bald eagle's nest on that entire stretch. So these were really the record low numbers for bald eagle populations. And this is what we refer to as eagles being on the brink of extinction. But eventually, some positive changes did start occurring. In 1962, Rachel Carson released her book, Silent Spring, which really alerted the public to what DDT was doing to the environment. And this caused huge public outcry, so that eventually in 1972, DDT was actually banned in the United States. Then in 1973, Congress passed the Endangered Species Act, and soon after that, bald eagles were added to that list in the lower 48 states. So now we can claim that there are probably over 10,000 nesting pairs in the lower 48 states. And even though bald eagles were able to be removed from the endangered species list in 2007, which is a great thing, they are actually still a federally protected species under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So the Endangered Species Act really served to protect eagles because it allowed for a lot of different things to happen that wouldn't normally happen. There were captive breeding programs where you would raise eagles from eggs in captivity and then reintroduce them into the wild. And it also allowed for funding for added protection for nesting sites and for bald eagle habitats. And this was not just the result of law enforcement. There was actually a lot of citizens that got involved in this effort, whether through protection of their habitats, by banding eagles and helping to keep track of how many were left in the wild. So really everyday citizens were involved in this effort to save the nation's symbol. And this is the type of action that we still need today. So there are still a lot of species that are threatened with extinction, as I mentioned earlier, and it's not all about those big majestic species like the bald eagle. There are a lot of other species that could be as delicate as a little butterfly or a small wildflower, and there's plenty of things that you can do to help these species. Even in your own backyard, you can develop habitat for species by putting up bird feeders or bird houses. You can plant a pollinator garden. You can volunteer for local conservation projects like removing garlic mustard or getting rid of buckthorn, that species of plants that are invasive and can outcompete the native species. And you can also help by educating yourself. Learn how to ID some of these plants and animals. Become a naturalist. There's a lot of really cool apps that you can use, like iNaturalist or the Merlin Bird ID app through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And some of these apps even have some citizen science components. You can actually be tracking some of these species, and that information helps scientists know the status and where some of these species are and what areas might need more protection. So thanks a lot for listening to this episode of Adventures in Eagle Territory. I also want to thank everybody who has contributed to our GoFundMe campaign, which is going to be used to fund more of these distance learning opportunities so that we can teach the whole world about eagles. Thank you very much.